The crisp autumn air was filled with the sound of crunching leaves and distant laughter as the small group of friends made their way from house to house, their bags gradually growing heavier with candy. The night was perfect. Clear skies, a bright full moon, and just enough of a breeze to send shivers down their spines. It was Halloween, after all. The magic of the night had a way of creeping in, even when everything seemed ordinary. Lila, dressed as a witch, was the leader of the group, her pointy hat slightly crooked and her broomstick dragging behind her. Beside her, Max, wearing a skeleton costume, cracked jokes, trying to ease the tension that had been building ever since they ventured into the older part of the neighborhood. Noah, the youngest of the group, was a pirate this year, his wooden sword clutched tightly in his hand, as if it offered some sort of protection. "I think we should head back," Noah muttered, glancing over his shoulder at the houses they'd passed, their windows dark and uninviting. "Come on, Noah. We've barely scratched the surface," Lila said, her voice confident but her eyes darting nervously to the shadows. "There's bound to be more candy on this side of town." Just as they approached a particularly old and creaky house, something shifted in the darkness behind them. Max stopped short, his skeleton makeup doing little to hide the sudden unease on his face. Lila turned slowly, her breath catching in her throat. Out of the shadows, a figure emerged, dressed in a long, flowing cloak that seemed to absorb the very light of the moon. The newcomer moved without a sound. A white mask covered their face, blank and emotionless, save for the two hollow black eyes staring back at them. The figure held a trick-or-treat bag in one gloved hand, though it looked empty, unlike theirs, which were bulging with candy. "Nice costume," Max called out, his voice shaky despite the forced grin on his face. "Creepy, but cool." The Phantom didn't respond. Instead, they stepped closer, the sound of rustling leaves the only sign of their approach. Lila cleared her throat, trying to shake off the unease. Hey, do you want to join us? We're hitting a few more houses before heading back." The Phantom nodded, a slow, deliberate movement, and without a word, fell in step with the group. Noah, eyes wide, tugged at Lila's sleeve. "I don't like this," he whispered. "They're weird." Lila gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "It's fine. Just someone really getting into the spirit of Halloween." But even Lila couldn't fully shake the cold feeling creeping up her spine. There was something unsettling about the way the Phantom moved. Too smooth, too quiet, like they weren't quite part of the world around them. As the group continued down the street, the other houses seemed to grow farther apart, the lights dimmer and the air colder. Max, usually the loudest of the bunch, had gone strangely silent, occasionally glancing back at the Phantom, who followed just a step behind, always close enough to feel but never saying a word. "I think we're getting lost," Noah mumbled, his voice barely audible over the wind that had picked up. Lila stopped, looking around. The neighborhood had changed. The familiar streets and houses were fading, replaced by narrow, winding paths that stretched into the woods ahead. The trees seemed taller here, their branches casting long, twisted shadows across the ground. The Phantom pointed silently toward the path leading deeper into the woods. "We should turn around," Max said, his voice tight with unease. "This doesn't feel right." Lila hesitated. She could feel it too, the chill, the way the air felt heavier, as if it was pressing down on them. But there was something about the Phantom, something that made her want to follow. She didn't know why, but she felt drawn to them, to the mystery they brought. "Just one more stop," she said quietly. "Let's see where they're leading us." Without waiting for an answer, Lila stepped forward, and one by one the others followed. The phantom moved silently beside them, their presence a haunting reminder that this Halloween was about to become far more than just a night of tricks and treats. The deeper they ventured into the woods, the more the world seemed to shift. The laughter of trick-or-treaters faded behind them, replaced by the whisper of wind through the trees and the crunch of dried leaves underfoot. It felt as though they had crossed an invisible boundary, leaving the safety of the neighborhood behind. The moon, once bright and comforting, was now obscured by thick branches, casting jagged shadows across the path ahead. Noah clutched Lila's arm, his pirate hat slipping slightly as his fear grew. "I don't like this, Lila. We should go back." Lila glanced back at the others. Max, usually the brave one, looked uneasy. His skeleton makeup seemed almost ghostly in the dim light, and he hadn't cracked a joke in several minutes. Even he sensed something was wrong. But it was the phantom, still trailing silently behind them, that made her hesitate. There was something magnetic about them, something that made it hard to turn back. "We're almost there," Lila said, though she wasn't sure where there was. She tried to sound confident, but her voice wavered slightly. The path narrowed as they continued, winding deeper into the forest. The trees were taller here, their trunks thick and twisted, as if they had been growing for centuries. Every so often, the phantom would raise a hand, pointing in a new direction, and the group would follow without question. It felt like they were being led by an invisible force, something stronger than their own instincts. Max stopped abruptly, staring ahead with wide eyes. "Wait, do you hear that?" They all froze. At first, there was nothing but the rustling of leaves in the wind, but then, faintly, a sound reached their ears. A distant, hollow melody like wind chimes or a broken music box, echoing through the trees. "It's coming from up ahead," Lila whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. Noah tugged on her sleeve, his voice shaking. "Please, Lila, we should go back." Before Lila could respond, the phantom moved forward, gliding down the path without hesitation. They seemed almost to float, their movements so smooth and silent. Without thinking, Lila followed, her legs moving as if on their own. The others had no choice but to follow too. The forest grew darker, the air colder, as the sound grew louder. It wasn't just music anymore. It was a voice, soft and lilting, whispering words they couldn't quite understand. The path opened into a small clearing, and there, at the center, stood a single twisted tree. Its branches were bare, and its bark was as dark as midnight, as though it had been scorched long ago. At the base of the tree there was something strange. A sign, old and weathered, its letters barely visible under layers of moss and thyme. Lila knelt down to brush it off, revealing the words carved deeply into the wood. "Beware the midnight bell. The forest keeps those who fail." Her heart skipped a beat, and she stood quickly, the words ringing in her head. What did it mean? The air around them seemed to thicken, a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. Max stepped forward, peering at the sign with narrowed eyes. "Midnight? What happens at midnight?" "I don't know," Lila said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't think we're supposed to be here." The phantom, still as silent as ever, stood by the tree, their blank mask reflecting the faint moonlight that trickled through the canopy. They raised one hand and pointed to the path ahead, a narrow trail that seemed to disappear into the darkness. Lila's heart raced. Every instinct told her to run, to turn back and get out of the forest before it was too late. But something about the phantom kept her frozen in place. The promise of more mystery, more secrets, called to her, even as fear gripped her. Max took a step back, his breath quickening. I don't know about this. I don't like the sound of that sign. Midnight's only an hour away. Noah's eyes were wide with fear, his small voice trembling. Can't we just go home? Please. Lila hesitated, torn between the safety of retreating and the pull of the phantom's strange, unspoken promise. She swallowed hard, glancing at Max and Noah, who both looked ready to turn and run. We'll go a little further, Lila said softly, though even she wasn't sure why. Just a little further. And so they continued, the phantom leading them deeper into the heart of the forest, where the shadows grew darker and the air colder as the midnight bell loomed closer with every step. The darkness of the forest seemed to swallow the group whole, their footsteps muted by the thick blanket of leaves and the oppressive silence that stretched between the trees. The path ahead twisted and turned, the phantom leading them deeper into what felt like a maze of shadows. Every few moments, Lila glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see the neighborhood lights still within reach, but they were long gone, replaced by the thick, gnarled branches that loomed above them. Noah clung tightly to Max's sleeve, his small pirate sword forgotten at his side. Lila, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. What if we can't get out? Lila didn't answer. She didn't know the answer herself. Something in the air had changed since they entered the forest. It felt heavier, as if the trees themselves were watching them. Still, she couldn't shake the strange pull that kept her moving forward, the phantom's silent presence urging her on. Suddenly, the phantom stopped. Without turning, they pointed ahead, where the path widened into another clearing. This one was different from the last, though. In the center stood a stone pedestal, weathered and covered in moss. Atop it was an old, cracked lantern that flickered with an eerie blue flame, casting faint light across the clearing. The group hesitated at the edge, their breath hanging in the cold night air. For a moment, none of them moved. Then, a voice echoed through the trees, soft yet clear, as if it came from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Answer, or stay forevermore. Lila's heart jumped into her throat. Who said that? She whispered, looking around. There was no one but the trees, swaying slightly in the breeze. The phantom stood motionless, as if they already knew what was coming. Another voice rang out, this one colder, harsher, with an almost playful tone. First riddle. I am not alive, but I grow. I do not have lungs, but I need air. I do not have a mouth, but water kills me. What am I? Max blinked, stepping closer to Lila. What was that? He asked, his voice strained. A riddle? Noah's grip tightened on Max's sleeve. I don't like this. We shouldn't have come here. Lila bit her lip, her mind racing. A riddle. They'd been led here for this. She could feel the weight of it pressing down on her. The clearing felt more claustrophobic now, as if the trees were closing in, waiting for them to answer. The phantom didn't move, simply standing by the edge of the clearing, watching. It was clear that whatever happened next depended on them. Lila repeated the riddle aloud. Not alive, but it grows. No lungs, but it needs air. No mouth, but water kills it. She thought hard, her heart thudding in her chest. What could it be? Her mind sifted through possibilities, but the pressure made it difficult to focus. Max suddenly perked up, snapping his fingers. I think I know. Fire. Lila turned to him. What? Fire, he repeated more confidently now. It's not alive, but it grows. It needs air to burn, and water puts it out. That's gotta be it. The The moment he spoke the answer, the blue flame in the lantern flickered wildly before surging higher, casting a strange light across the trees. Then, just as quickly as it had flared, the flame died down, leaving only the soft glow behind. The voice returned, softer now, almost approving. Correct. Lila let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She glanced at Max, who gave her a small, relieved smile, though his face was still pale. Noah's eyes were wide, his fear growing by the second. Before any of them could relax, the Phantom stepped forward, gliding past them toward the pedestal. They paused briefly, their mask turning slightly in Lila's direction, as if to silently acknowledge her and the others. Then, without a word, they turned and pointed to another narrow path leading deeper into the forest. Max shook his head, his voice tight with tension. "There's more, isn't there?" Lila nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the path ahead. The riddle had been solved, but the night was far from over. The forest still felt alive around them, and the presence of the Phantom was a constant reminder that they had only just begun whatever strange game this was. "Come on," she said, though her voice was quieter now. "We can't stop here." With the Phantom leading them once again, they moved forward, the weight of the forest pressing down harder with each step. Whatever lay ahead, they knew it would only get more dangerous the deeper they ventured. The midnight bell was ticking closer with every moment. The forest grew darker as they continued, the trees closing in around them like looming sentinels. The path was barely visible now, swallowed by roots and shadows. The eerie blue light from the Phantom's lantern provided just enough to keep them moving forward, but it cast strange, elongated shapes on the ground that seemed to twist and shift as they walked. Max's voice cut through the silence. "How many more riddles do you think there are?" His usual bravado had all but disappeared, and his words were tinged with unease. Lila didn't answer. She was too focused on the Phantom, who seemed to know exactly where they were going. The further they walked, the more she felt it, the strange, almost magnetic pull that had guided her since they first met the mysterious figure. It was as though the forest itself was calling them deeper, and with each step, the sense of unease grew stronger. Noah stumbled over a root, grabbing Lila's arm for balance. "This is bad, Lila," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't want to do this anymore." Before Lila could respond, the Phantom stopped abruptly at the edge of a large clearing. The trees here were different, taller, older, their branches twisted into grotesque shapes that seemed to reach out like claws. Thick, dark vines coiled around their trunks, and the air was colder, biting at their skin. At the center of the clearing stood a large, ancient tree, its bark gnarled and blackened as if it had been struck by lightning. This was no ordinary part of the forest. Lila knew instinctively that this was the Forbidden Grove. A low, whispering sound filled the air, like the wind through dry leaves. But Lila realized it wasn't wind at all. It was voices, soft, unintelligible, and haunting. They seemed to rise from the ground itself, swirling around the clearing. Max shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting from the Phantom to the ancient tree. "What is this place?" he muttered, his voice tense. Before anyone could answer, the whispering voices grew louder, clearer, forming words that echoed in their ears. "The second challenge awaits. Face your greatest fears, or remain lost forever." Lila's heart raced as the words settled over them like a thick fog. "Face your greatest fears." She exchanged a glance with Max, who looked pale and shaken, his usual confidence crumbling. Noah stood frozen beside her, his small frame trembling. The Phantom didn't move, standing at the edge of the clearing, waiting. It was clear this was the next test, but the rules were unclear. There were no riddles this time, no puzzles to solve, just the forest, watching. Without warning, the vines that coiled around the ancient tree began to shift and move, slithering across the ground like snakes. They curled toward the group, slow but deliberate, their thorny tips glistening in the faint light. Max stumbled backward, his voice tight with panic. What is this? Lila took a step back as well, her breath quickening. She could feel it now, the weight of her own fear pressing down on her chest. The vines continued to creep closer, their movements unnatural, as if they were being guided by some unseen force. Then, the whispering returned. But this time, it was different. The voices were louder, more insistent, as if they were speaking directly to each of them. For Lila, the voice was clear, sharp, and unmistakable. It spoke her deepest fear aloud, in a voice that echoed with cruel certainty. "You'll never be enough. You'll lead them all to ruin." The words cut deep, sending a shiver down her spine. She blinked, trying to focus, but the forest seemed to swirl around her, the weight of her own doubt pressing in from all sides. Max's eyes were wide with fear, and he took another shaky step back. "Lila, we need to leave. Now." But the forest had them. The vines were closer now, circling the group like predators. The whispering grew louder, feeding on their fear, as if the forest itself was alive, thriving off their terror. Lila clenched her fists, her pulse racing. She couldn't let the fear consume her. She had to stay strong, for herself, for Max, for Noah. But the voices wouldn't stop. They clawed at her mind, repeating their cruel, haunting messages, each one driving her deeper into panic. "You'll fail. You're alone." Noah whimpered beside her, his voice barely a whisper. "Lila, make it stop. Please, make it stop." The phantom, still silent, raised a hand and pointed toward the ancient tree at the center of the grove. The movement was slow, deliberate, and with it came an understanding. This wasn't a test they could run from. They had to face it. Taking a deep breath, Lila stepped forward, her eyes locked on the phantom's gesture. The vines hesitated as if waiting. She could feel her heart pounding, fear clawing at the edges of her mind, but she pushed it down. "I'm not afraid of you," she whispered, though her voice shook slightly. "I'm not afraid." With that, she moved toward the ancient tree, her steps slow but steady, as the forest seemed to hold its breath. The phantom remained still, watching as the challenge unfolded before them. Lila's heart raced as she approached the ancient tree, the weight of her fear pressing down on her like an invisible hand. Every step felt heavier, as though the forest itself was trying to pull her back. Behind her, Max and Noah stood frozen, the vines circling closer, waiting for her to make the next move. The phantom watched in silence, their hollow eyes following her every step. When Lila reached the tree, she could see its twisted, blackened bark up close. It seemed to pulse with a strange energy, as if something dark was trapped inside it, waiting to be unleashed. The whispering voices had quieted, but the oppressive weight of the grove still hung thick in the air. She placed her hand on the bark, the rough surface cold against her palm. Suddenly, the ground trembled beneath her feet, and the whispers returned, louder now, more insistent. "Face your truth." The voice seemed to echo inside her head, not just around her. She swallowed hard, her fingers curling into the bark. She didn't know what that meant, what truth she was supposed to face. But before she could even process it, the tree began to glow with a faint, eerie light. The The glow spread slowly, illuminating the vines that had encircled her friends. Max took a shaky step forward, his face pale. "Lila, what's happening?" Before she could answer, a loud crack split the air, and the tree's bark split open, revealing a hollow space inside. Within it, something shimmered. A small, silver object, barely visible in the dim light. Lila hesitated, then reached into the hollow. Her fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. When she pulled it out, she realized it was a mirror. A small, handheld mirror, its surface covered in dust. Confused, she wiped it clean and stared into the glass. Her reflection stared back at her, but something was wrong. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. But it wasn't just her fear. It was something deeper, something she hadn't wanted to face. In the reflection, she saw herself alone, standing in the dark, the weight of her failures crushing down on her. The voice returned, its cruel whisper echoing in her mind. "You're not strong enough. You'll fail them." Lila's hands shook as she stared into the mirror, her own reflection staring back, twisted by doubt. Her chest tightened as the voices clawed at her mind, pulling her deeper into the fear she'd been trying to avoid. But then, something shifted. The mirror's surface rippled, and suddenly, her reflection wasn't alone. Max and Noah stood beside her, their faces etched with fear, but also with trust. They had followed her into the forest even when they were scared. They believed in her. Lila took a deep breath, forcing herself to look past the fear. She wasn't alone. The forest wanted her to believe she was, but that wasn't the truth. She had her friends, and they were counting on her. "I'm not afraid," she whispered, her voice gaining strength. "Not anymore." The mirror's surface shimmered, and the reflection shifted again, this time showing her standing tall, surrounded by her friends, the vines retreating into the darkness. The phantom's reflection appeared behind them, watching silently. With a sudden burst of confidence, Lila lowered the mirror and turned to face the phantom. "I've had enough of your games. What do you want from us?" The phantom remained still for a long moment, their blank mask revealing nothing. Then, slowly, they raised their hand and pointed to the mirror. Lila frowned, holding it up. "What is this supposed to show me?" The phantom tilted their head slightly, and the whispering voices grew louder again. "Truth." It was then that Lila realized what the phantom had been doing all along. The forest wasn't just testing their courage or their ability to solve riddles. It was testing their ability to face themselves, to see the truth behind their fears. The phantom's true game wasn't about tricking them. It was about forcing them to confront their own doubts and insecurities. Max stepped forward, his voice uncertain. "So, we're supposed to face what scares us most?" Lila nodded slowly, understanding dawning on her. "Yes, that's what this place is. It's not just a haunted forest. It's a reflection of everything we're afraid of. The phantom's been guiding us through it, showing us what we need to face." Noah, still trembling, looked up at Lila with wide eyes. "But what if we can't? What if we're too scared?" Lila knelt beside him, her voice soft but steady. "You don't have to do it alone, Noah. None of us do." The phantom stepped closer, their mask still unreadable, but Lila no longer felt the same fear toward them. Instead, she felt a strange sense of understanding. The phantom wasn't their enemy. It was a guide, leading them through the darkness of the forest and the darkness within themselves. The vines around them began to retreat, curling back into the shadows as the oppressive weight of the grove lifted slightly. The air felt lighter, and for the first time since entering the forest, Lila felt like they might actually make it out, but she knew there was still one more challenge ahead. Midnight was fast approaching, and the Phantom's game wasn't over yet. The eerie quiet of the forest was broken only by the distant rustle of leaves and the faint, whispering wind. Lila glanced at the Phantom, their hollow eyes fixed on the path ahead, and knew what came next. Midnight was approaching fast, and the final challenge lay before them. There was no turning back now. The group moved cautiously, the atmosphere around them thick with tension. Every step felt like a countdown, the air growing colder with each passing minute. Max kept glancing at his watch, his voice filled with urgency. "It's almost midnight. We have to hurry." Lila nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this last part wouldn't be as simple as running. The Phantom's game had tested them in ways they hadn't expected, facing their fears, solving riddles, and unraveling the truth behind their insecurities. Whatever was waiting for them at the end of this path would be more than just a race against time. As they walked, the trees began to thin, and in the distance they could see the outline of something tall, jagged and foreboding. It was a large stone gate, old and covered in moss, with strange symbols etched into the surface. Beyond the gate, the path disappeared into darkness. The Phantom came to a stop in front of the gate, turning to face them. Lila's heart raced. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This was it, the final test. The whispering voice returned, echoing through the clearing like a distant hollow chime. The final challenge. The bell tolls for those who fail. Find the key, and freedom is yours. Fail, and the forest will claim you. Max's face paled. Find the key? Where? We don't have time for this. Lila swallowed hard, her eyes scanning the gate. The stone was ancient, its surface covered in twisting vines that seemed to move with the breeze. The strange symbols carved into the gate glowed faintly in the moonlight, but there was no obvious keyhole, no place to insert anything. Noah tugged on her sleeve, his voice small. What if the key isn't a real key? What if it's something else? Lila's breath caught. Noah was right. This whole night had been filled with riddles and illusions. The key they were looking for probably wasn't an object at all. It was something they had to understand, something they had to unlock within themselves. She turned to the Phantom, who stood silently beside the gate, watching. Is the key us? Do we have to prove something? The Phantom didn't respond, but Lila knew she was on the right track. The challenges they'd faced had been designed to make them confront their fears, their doubts, and their deepest truths. The key had to be tied to that somehow. Max was pacing now, his frustration growing. There's no time for riddles. We have to figure this out fast. Noah, still clinging to Lila, looked up at her with wide eyes. What if we've already found the key? We faced the riddles, the vines, everything. Maybe we just need to believe we can get out. Lila's eyes widened. Noah was right. They had already done what the forest asked of them. The key wasn't something they needed to find. It was something they had already earned. They had faced their fears, solved the riddles, and uncovered the truth behind the Phantom's game. She stepped forward, placing her hand on the gate. For a moment, nothing happened, and her heart sank. But then slowly, the gate began to tremble, the stone vibrating under her palm. The vines that had coiled around it loosened, retreating into the ground as the ancient symbols flared with light. Max's eyes widened. It's working. The stone gate groaned as it swung open, revealing the dark path beyond. Lila's heart leapt, but the eerie chime of a distant bell cut through the night, its sound growing louder, closer. Midnight was coming. and they weren't out of the woods yet. The Phantom stepped aside, motioning for them to pass through the gate. But just as Lila moved to follow, the ground beneath them began to shake violently. The trees groaned, their branches twisting in the wind, and the path ahead flickered like a mirage. "The bell," Noah whispered, fear creeping into his voice. "It's almost midnight." Lila grabbed his hand, pulling him forward. "Run!" The group sprinted through the gate, the air around them thick with the sound of the approaching bell. Behind them, the forest seemed to close in, the trees twisting and writhing as if trying to trap them. Lila's breath came in sharp gasps, her heart pounding in her chest as they raced toward the light at the end of the path. The bell tolled louder, its sound echoing through the trees like a final warning. One last toll, and they would be lost. But then, as the final chime rang out, the group burst through the clearing, tumbling onto the familiar streets of their neighborhood. The cold air of the forest vanished, replaced by the soft glow of streetlights and the distant sound of trick-or-treaters laughing in the distance. They had made it. Panting, Lila turned to look back at the forest. The gate had vanished, and the trees stood still once more, silent and dark. The Phantom was nowhere to be seen. Max collapsed onto the sidewalk, breathless but relieved. "We're out. We're finally out." Noah, still clutching Lila's hand, smiled weakly. "We did it." Lila looked at the spot where the Phantom had been, her heart still racing. The forest had let them go, but she knew that whatever force lay behind it would still be there, waiting. But they had faced it, and they had won. For now, the game was over. Oh, the game.